and we're looking at the Constitution right now. And both of these things are very important. What's the number one founding belief? The freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. So I can collect with any group of people I want and we can express ourselves in a way, and that's our constitutional right. Example of a group of rebels doing that would be the American founding fathers when they rebelled against the British Empire and formed their own country. The Second Amendment in support of the first one was, in the face of tyranny, we have the right to bear arms. So if there's a tyrannical government in place attacking or overtaxing our families, we have the right to rebel against that and to assert ourselves in the name of freedom. So we understand that that is the American founding message. Now, let's take a look at the Black Panther Party. In Oakland, in the 60s, what were police doing today? They were going into the neighborhoods and they were terrorizing people of the black community. The very ethos of the Black Panther Party is based off the first two amendments of the American Constitution. So when we talk about ethnicity, they have the same beliefs as Americans. They share the same language. They share the same religion. They're both liberal, so that means that they're going to use democracy as the basis of which to govern themselves. So if you give black groups empowerment, is it going to disrupt the foundation or the sovereignty of the United States? Ethnically speaking and ideologically speaking, no. You have people actually acting within the same belief systems within the American Constitution in order to claim their own right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And another examples of how this gets misconstrued, blacks, especially in America, are often criminalized. So what are the two most notorious criminal organizations that people know of black culture? Crips and the Bloods. Crips were founded on the same belief as the Black Panther Party. Bloods were founded on the same principles and beliefs of the Black Panther Party. Did you know that Crips is an acronym for Community Revolution in Progress? Let that sink in. Bloods is also an acronym. Brotherly love overcomes and overrides destruction. Though these groups have been pushed into a different direction, their very fabric of what brought these individuals, regardless of their race, together was the same fundamental belief system that brought the United States of America together. When I take a step back and I look at ethnicity as a whole and is based off a shared common history, shared common language, are they really that much different? Within the context of North America, there's 5 distinct ethno-categories of non-immigrant groups. The reason why they're non-immigrant groups is these groups are been born in this continent for generations. Despite wherever their origin comes from, it's almost half a millennia old. I understand that there is this concept of black diaspora, and that is a very fair objection where, black people have been robbed of their culture and they don't even know what it is. Or in order to accept that, you'd have to deny over 500 years of history. You talk to a black person today, yes, I'm Caribbean, Canadian, or African American, you put them in Africa, they're not going to speak the same language, they're not going to share the same customs, they're not going to share the same beliefs. In order to reclaim that lost heritage, you'd have to overrule 500 years of history, and in doing so isn't really going to serve much purpose in terms of moving the needle forward. Well, let me get back to those 5 ethno-category or racial categories. So you have Latin, Spanish-speaking people. So in context of this conversation, I'm already going to take them and throw them out of this conversation, and here's why. One, the United States was in direct war with Spain in 1898. And so south of the United States, Mexico, Central America, South America, all those states speak Spanish. So that's their ethnicity. That's their binding thing. They'll practice Catholicism, a more specific branch of Christianity. And they'll all have their sovereign states. They all have their own rights and protections and their own statuses within their own laws. So though they may come to America and face injustice, they already have sovereignty elsewhere. So done. Out of the conversation. Native Americans. Very important to talk about. Whole different conversation for another day, but they're a factor. Quebecois, French-speaking people. And so we're going to hold on to those. You have African American and you have white Americans or Anglo-Saxon Americans or Canadians. Let's look at white Americans and African Americans when it comes to language, religion, history, political identity, economics, and beliefs. And I'm looking at it from, the perspective of the most dangerous African American groups. So, white Americans and African Americans, what's their binding language? English. So, from the definition of Stephen Vera, they have the same binding thing that makes them one ethnicity and one culture. That's language, especially when it's written and becomes cemented. Religion. Both practice Protestantism. And the reason why I didn't say Christianity is because Catholicism has its own different ways, practices, and beliefs that infiltrate society on many different factors, but very specifically, Anglo-Saxons and African Americans practice Christianity in the form of Protestantism. White Americans and African Americans share the same history. So, though one was on the side of the oppressor and one was on the side of the oppressed, the reality is they're different sides of the same coin. It's the same origin story. So within the foundation of America, and like I talked about in my last video, their relationship is symbiotic. One cannot exist without the other. So yeah, we're going to be talking about, the differences on being on different sides, but it's different sides of the same history, the same story. Political identity. They're both liberals. And what I mean by liberals is they both believe in democracy. So if I were to give more rights to, African Americans or even white Americans, they're going to still live out the liberal ethos. An example of why political identity is important, we'll say on a legal level, is if you look at Islam, they practice Sharia law, and that's something that might be important to them. But if you give extreme Islamic people political, at least complete legal and political freedom, what are they going to do? They're going to try to implement Sharia law within the American Constitution, and that's going to uproot it. I'm not saying, I'm not advocating for injustice towards a different religious group. My point is that there are cases where if you give another group influence, they will implement things that will uproot the very values that the country's based off, hence live out the security dilemma and zero sum. So there are cases within Black Panther where they wanted to pursue Marxism and communism, but either way, 90%, 95% of African Americans and white Americans are capitalists. They live in a free market society, and so if you give them more freedom or political control, for the most part, throughout most of American history, they're going to pursue capitalistic or free market ideas, period. Beliefs. First Amendment. Freedom of assembly, right to bear arms. So the Black Panther Party, as I mentioned earlier, share the same fundamental beliefs of which the country was founded on. We're a group of American people, so Americanism. And if you give us our rights, we're going to stand up and protect people in our own community. Now, what that's been inverted is Black people are demonized for acting out the same values and beliefs that have been brought up within the American Constitution, and we're going to stomp that out today. But it's important to understand that what I'm about to claim here is that white American and African Americans share the same ethnicity, and that ethnicity is just Americanism, period. And for my own personal example, I had American teammates that come up to Toronto, Canada. We have blacks in Canada who are Caribbean descent, do not speak the same way, or maybe we share some things, but they're like, yo, what do you guys talk about? Y'all are different. Y'all, like, you're weird ass, whatever. So my point is that Americanism is not exclusive to white or not exclusive to black. They share it. So fundamentally, if you give them the same rights and the same privileges, it's not going to enact a security dilemma or uproot the foundations of what America is founded on. And that's just based off the definition of Stephen Vera when it comes to ethnicity. So when it comes to ethnic conflict, it's not justified to look at African Americans through a different lens and see them as a threat. Now let's talk about Native Americans and Quebecois. So language. Native Americans in both Canada and the United States speak many different languages. In Canada, which is very important to note, there's three distinctions of Native Americans. You have Métis, which is of mixed heritage and mixed descent, Aboriginal, and Inuit. So even within Canada, yes, there's Native American status, but Canada goes that extra length to respect the individual status of three different subgroups. And we'll talk more about that later. Origin story. Well, Native American origin exists without the foundations of Westphalian Westphalia means pretty much how a state's formed, so boundaries, borders, and all the things that make a state a state. Well, they exist outside that belief system. And to this day, they don't accept Canadian or American sovereignty, and they have a legitimate reason to believe that. But if you were to give Native Americans the power to enact their own ethnic beliefs, it would threaten the sovereignty of Canada and the United States. Fact. So political identity, they seek their own sovereignty, and they even seek their own sovereignty from their own distinct tribes. So they don't, politically, they don't exist within the concept of liberalism. Beliefs. Well, they believe that their land was stolen from them. So if you were to give them power, what would they do? They'd reclaim their land back. And then that would ignite an ethnic conflict, which would end in mass transportation, partition, secession, or genocide. Next, Quebecois, language, French. So you look at Canadian history, English-speaking people and French-speaking people, they had ethnic conflict, and we were able to resolve it. There was mass transportation, so the English-speaking Anglophones rounded up all the French-speaking people, banished them to Acadia, which is in the Maritimes, and then there was a massacre there, and they banished the Acadians to Louisiana, and that's when they had their slang and their dialect, and that's where you get Cajun from. It's Cajun culture. It's French from Acadia in Canada. But my point is, there was ethnic conflict even within Canada between different language groups. That's how important it is to distinguish ethnicity by language. Religion, Catholicism. And so with that, they believed in organizing themselves in a royal setting differently based off their Catholic beliefs. History, New France. So as far as Quebec is concerned, they had their own sovereign state of New France. And then there was the Louisiana Purchase within the United States. So France, colonialism has a large history within the project in North America, but we forget that because why? It doesn't exist within our ethno group. Right? We don't know it as much as we know about the African American experience because the African American experience exists within our ethno group. The French culture exists outside our ethno group. Cool. Political identity, liberal. But legally speaking, even within Quebec today, they don't practice British common law. Or in the States, they have their own form of legal system, but they practice the Napoleonic Code. So because of the basis of their language, they practice a different legal system to ours. So, arguably speaking, if you were to grant France or French-speaking people power and autonomy, they could arguably impose Napoleonic Code throughout the rest of Canada and the United States. That would be grounds for ethnic conflict. Beliefs. Quebec and French identity needs to be protected and distinct from English culture. That's their belief system. It needs to be protected. Oh, I've given you 4 different examples of different non-immigrant people within, the context of North America. So what I'm about to share with you next is going to lead our conversation towards the positive and solution-oriented direction of this conversation. My question to you is, if you're still watching, what do Native Americans and Quebecois or Francophones have that African Americans don't? I'm going to let you think about it.